So I have a quick change. Carlos Noel, get up and get over here. We're going to swap George's presentation for Carlos. Carlos has been summoned to get back home, and so he's going to do his keynote now. Can I move this forward, please? Carlos Noel is the VP of Transformation and Innovation at National Grid. Give it a hand, please.
So, good morning, everyone, and thanks for the flexibility. You know, it's ironic we're talking about cryptocurrency and energy and all those fun things. And for those of you that are not from here and have to travel today, the airport just lost power. And as Andres said, I'm supposed to head back to Boston. So I've moved my flight, and I just got a cancellation on my flight because they don't have power at the airport. So it just puts in perspective how important the work we all do, even though the not flashy stuff, we still need to keep the lights on every single day. So I don't know how I'll probably go with the slides. So this will be a slightly different keynote, but I wanted to talk a little bit about what we're doing at National Grid. So we're in the Northeast. We are a gas and electric utility, both in the US and the UK. Pretty large. We serve roughly 6 million customers here in the US and about the same amount of customers and accounts in the UK. We have both transmission, distribution, and retail. We have some generation, and we have some unregulated businesses. And you know, for anyone that has visited the US, the Northeast, you know that it's probably one of those states and parts of the country where there's a lot of pressure to get to the clean energy goals, pretty competitive with California. It feels that we're always competing with California, whether it's New York or Massachusetts. We're always trying to see who's going to get to net zero as quickly as possible. And that's all fantastic and it's great, but our system in the Northeast, it's extremely obsolete. I always tell people we have a distribution line that has been there since the beginning of electricity. So it's in Great Barrington, it's still in service. It's not the original cable, but it's still that line, it's still there, right? So it is a pretty old system. And when you think about some of the challenges and the things that our states wants to do, right? So just for reference, so we operate in New York, in Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. I don't know why this is not going. But when you think about the commitments that all those three states have made in the Northeast, right? They want electrified heat, right? If you've ever been there, it's not like Texas. It gets really, really cold in the winter, right? So the bulk of our heating, it's either delivered fuels, meaning oil, or propane, or wood in some cases. And the other half of it is gas. Right? And there's a lot of controversy around whether gas is still a viable solution. They also want to electrify heavily transportation, right? And in addition to that, we are bringing a ton of wind into our system, a ton of solar into our system. So when you think about that combination, right, I always tell people it's great in paper, but the reality is for people like me that have to make sure that the system actually works every single day, it becomes a bit of a challenge. So kind of how do we think about this challenge for National Grid? So I think about it in a couple of ways. So the first and foremost is, as I said at the beginning, the grid actually needs to work. It needs to work every single day. And that's one of the things that in the Northeast, when you have power outages, when you have windstorms, if you have weather events, it becomes critically important, right? Since COVID, I always tell people we used to have, people used to have tolerance that on the second day of a massive event after a big storm, people were still somewhat understandable of, not having power. Now, after a few hours, everyone is calling the call center. Everyone is putting on social media that we're not doing great, right? So the expectations of our service, just the basic service we provide, has increased significantly. The expectations on the fuels that we use to generate and bring power into our customers has changed quite a bit, right? The amount of load that we're taking now from wind and solar, it's almost getting to 30–40% at some point during the day, right? That is pretty significant, right? And how do we balance the system, a really old system, with those resources and still keep the lights on every single day becomes a bit of a challenge. The second piece of it is, we're starting to enter a world where our system, we're one of the few utilities that didn't have AMI. So we were early adopters of AMR, and we don't have AMI. So it's interesting that in one of the most progressive states, we didn't really have big grid modernization programs. We didn't have AMI programs. So we're essentially playing catch up in our states today just to make sure that we can still provide power. So I always tell people, a lot of that, it's all fun and good. And when we did the grid modernization plans, because my team did it, we were talking about $3-4 billion just to get up to date, right? And that's, you can put that on a paper, you can put it on a regulatory filing, but the reality is it all comes down to a customer paying the bills. And not only we have issues on the distribution side because we have to keep an old system running, we have to make all these massive investments that we have to make. In addition to that, just the fact that we're so far from you guys here in Texas where the gas is being produced, that means that the cost of electricity that is generated using gas and the cost of heating that is also being primarily done by gas, it's extremely expensive. In this coming winter, we're expecting an increase of roughly 100% in our customers' bills for this coming winter, right? So, when you think about it, it's like, great, we need to modernize the grid, we need to do new things, we need to do all of that. And I completely agree with it. The question is, how do you actually do it in a way that it's still cost effective? So I've been pondering that question for a long, long time. And when you have programs like the ones that I run, grid modernization, AMI, even customer billing system transformation, which no one wants to do that, but you have to do it at times, you're talking about really big programs that take forever and they cost a fortune. So for us, the answer has been kind of, first, we needed to get back to the basics. So we realized that, everyone talks about kind of DERMS and they talk about AI and they talk about great things. And we're doing some of those things on a small pilot scale. But one of the things I've shared with the team is we cannot do any of that in a sustainable way until you fix your foundation, right? So I talked about not having AMI, right? For us, when we started to do AMI, we had an opportunity to do AMI like everyone else is doing, and we said, yeah, we can get the same meters that everyone else is doing, we can do the same networks that everyone else is doing. But the reality is we're so far behind that we really needed to push the envelope. So for our deployment, that we're actually in the midst of actually deploying meters right now, we actually decided to kind of leapfrog everyone. So one of the things that we are really pushing for is computing at the edge, right? When you're struggling to catch up, you need to think differently about the problems you have, right? So whether it's things like volt-var optimization, fault location, Flisser, you name it, right? All those different things, you need to think about how you do them differently. So the infrastructure we're putting in place, it's really pushing everything that we're trying to do to the edge. So the meters we're putting in are going to be meters that are going to have the ability to do processing, computing, and executing orders on the meter itself. Why is that a good thing? Because I don't have to start bringing data back and forth. That takes me time, that costs me money on the network, and it's less efficient, right? Because I can do it right there with the point where the decision needs to be made, right? Second thing we're doing is we're really trying to push kind of what kind of data do we actually get from those meters, right? So most people they do disaggregation today, right? And that's something that is not new. But we're actually pushing the envelope to get to a point where we actually understand exactly the signatures that every customer has in their homes. And what that allows us to do is really understanding a level of detail that no one has today on what are the devices that are happening, when are they turning on, when are they turning off, with a lot of certainty, which then, when you think about our planning process, we can actually start to make better decisions on how do we actually optimize our network based on the assets that the customers are running, not what we think they're running, right? And then the third piece of it is we're creating an ecosystem where, because we have the ability to do edge computing, now customers are going to be able to do, customers and vendors and anyone that is in the industry can actually create applications that run on the meter itself, right? And that's going to be a game changer for us because we don't have all the answers as a utility. We need to have others to help us in this journey to get to where we need to get to. And it always is about thinking about being efficient, right? You can do all the great things about transportation, you can do all the great things about renewables, but if you're not cost effective, you're still hurting your customers. So for us, kind of how do we think about using all this technology to be efficient? It's critically important. So all of this is probably not news to anyone, right? I mean, I think there's different utilities that are in different stages of this journey. But one of the things that we have found, it goes back to that first point, right? When you think about all this money you have to invest to get this value at the end of the journey, it's a really hard value proposition to discuss with customers. So the way we've changed our approach is really to think about how do we do this in smaller chunks. So this is a simple slide, but it actually shows how we're doing these projects. So I talked about a portfolio of roughly $3 billion that we're delivering over the next 10 years. And if you were to look at how this plan was initially created, we would spend all this money, and it wasn't until the end of this journey that we were going to start reaping up benefits. And in a traditional utility way, that probably feels right. If you have to build everything, everything has to work, everything has to be in place for you to get to the end. But the reality is, that's not the way people are expecting things today. So we actually have taken a more digital and agile approach in delivering all these big programs. And when we started this, I would say, including myself, I was a bit hesitant about whether you can deliver something like grid mod, something like AMI, something like a CIS system in an agile way. To me, I'm like, you have to build this thing in order for it to work, right? And you do have to wait until the end to get the value. And through a lot of discussions, through a lot of kind of back and forth, we've come up with plans that allow us to deliver those programs in a modular way, where we can, once we have a module, we can start delivering value in that module. So essentially what we've done is we've broken down all of our programs, right? AMI, grid modernization, CIS, and we've broken them down into smaller manageable chunks. And every year we just take a few of those chunks and say, we're going to focus on these 5 things, and those 5 things are the 5 things that are actually going to deliver the most amount of value for the customers or the organization. So for us, this journey has been a big mindset shift within the organization, because it feels at the beginning that you're kind of doing a lot of things like multiple times. Like, why do you have to do this if I already did it before? But the reality is, when you start to show value, you actually start to see the confidence of the teams to actually be more efficient, right? People feel like, wow, I don't have to wait 5 years to actually see a meter producing value, right? We did that in 9 months. We actually got meters in the field in 9 months, right? That's quite a bit. It doesn't have all the functionalities, and that's fine. That was by design. But we can build on it, right? So now, instead of having one team that is just working on deploying meters, I can have that 3 teams now that we have the platform in place. I can have 3 other teams, one working on grid applications, one working on customer engagement, and one working on grid resiliency, right? So it gives you the ability to have different modules and happening at the same time. We did the same thing with our ADMS implementation, right? ADMS, like for anyone that plays in the control rooms, you don't want to touch anything in the control room that might break, right? It is the most risk-averse environment that you're ever going to operate. Nothing is good enough, nothing is robust enough, and nothing is secure enough. So when we went through the journey and I said, we're going to do this agile, people were laughing at me. They were like, what are you talking about? Like, you're going to do the full implementation, we're going to test this to hell, and then once we have everything in place, then you can go live. And I'm like, okay, that's going to be a challenge, right? Because that means that, again, going back to the beginning of the discussion, you're not going to get any value until you go through all those steps. So I said, okay, what about if we just do, load balancing, right? Just to start. We're not going to do it all, we're just going to do load balancing. And we're going to have that module up and running, and you're going to play with it and see how it goes. We're not going to let it automatically control the system, but we're going to help your operators to start seeing what the information could look like and actually help them to make better choices. And they're like, okay, fine. Okay, we can give you a chance. And when we did the first one, they were like, wow, it's actually pretty cool. And once you kind of go through that first barrier, it's amazing how then people are saying, okay, great, so the next module I want you to work on is this. So it completely changes the conversation. And for anyone that works with utilities or is part of a utility, we are organizations that pride ourselves in making sure that people are safe, secure, and we have power to everyone. And some of these concepts kind of do introduce some level of risk that we're not used to. But I can tell you, kind of having gone through that journey kind of a few times now, it is really valuable. And I would encourage all of you, whether it's thinking about cryptocurrency and building those big facilities, or whether you're bringing something else, think about not only what you're doing, but thinking about how you're going to do it. Because it actually matters a hell of a lot. And I always tell people, the newer generations have less and less tolerance and patience. Like, I have younger kids. They seem to have zero patience because everything needs to be instantaneous to them. And when you start to get some of those 20-year-olds in the workforce, they're like, why is this taking so long? And initially my response is like, well, we have to do it all so it can work and be ready. The reality is it doesn't. And we've actually shown that it is possible to do this big transformation we're all trying to do, but actually in a slightly different way than everyone else is trying to do it. So I'll wrap up by just showing kind of how we've actually done this. So I talked about kind of the modularized piece. We've actually, I mean, this is a high-level one, but within each of those, they're like pieces of the puzzle. And we're not working on all of them at the same time. Once we have one, then we go to the next puzzle, right? And it's just a different way to go about it. And within each of those programs, we're breaking it down. We're thinking a way to kind of essentially piece this thing together in smaller chunks, incremental chunks, that still allow us to get to that end goal that we're talking about, but without actually having to take 7, 5, whatever number of years you can pick to get to that future. So my message to all of you is, this is a digital summit, right? And digital is not just the technology that we use to modernize the grid. That is part of the equation. How do we actually deploy those technologies probably matters as much as the technology you're deploying. So I would encourage people to think about the approach differently and give it a try. And even if it's scary, even when you get a lot of pushback, it's still, I can tell you, now seeing it on the other side, I can tell you it is possible. Even with things within the control rooms, it is possible. So thank you, everyone.